Margaery Tyrell is undoubtedly one of the most beloved characters in the history of Game of Thrones. She was introduced at arguably the peak of the series, and she was lucky enough to die in what I think is the best episode of television ever made, so she never suffered from the ultimate downfall of Game of Thrones. But the presentation of her character within the TV adaptation is interesting and sometimes a bit puzzling. And in both Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire, it's hard to know if the audience has ever seen the real Margaery Tyrell. Margaery is one of the rare characters whose TV version is exponentially more popular and beloved than her book version, but that can at least partially be credited to the fact that she is a much more minor character in A Song of Ice and Fire. But even beyond her larger role in Game of Thrones, it comes as no surprise that she's an incredibly well-liked character. Natalie Dormer undoubtedly slayed as the ambitious queen who was one of the few people who could actually serve as a significant rival to Cersei. And to see her play the titular game so masterfully for so long was an extremely entertaining addition to the overall storyline. Although the Tyrell family was heavily slimmed down in the transition from book to screen, their machinations and talent for politics were majorly enhanced. Olenna was undoubtedly the superstar of House Tyrell in Game of Thrones, but Margaery was an excellent protégé, and it was fascinating to see a familial dynamic that was so matriarchal and that so heavily relied on female power when so many other families completely disregarded the true importance and abilities of a lot of their female members. But that also makes sense. Although the TV series doesn't go into it, House Tyrell is one of the youngest and least established great houses in Westeros. They're honestly even pretty young and unestablished for a house in the Reach. And their social status among many nobles in the Seven Kingdoms is not as good as it might seem. They only became regional leaders in Aegon's conquest. And they only became leaders because they had spent centuries acting as servants to House Gardener, and then they took the place of House Gardener in the Reach after the Targaryens had killed them. Like many noble houses in the Reach, they can allegedly trace their lineage back to Garth Greenhand, but their descendants from this legend in the Age of Heroes comes from a female bloodline, not a male one. So with all of that in consideration, it makes sense that they would focus on acquiring power through the women in their family. It makes sense both because they would recognize the potential of that power, and because frankly, the only way they could even hope to have a shot at the throne at the present time would be through a female family member. Since Margaery is Mason Allery's only daughter, it's obvious why she has been groomed for queenhood since birth. The Margaery that readers meet in the book is a bit of an enigma, largely because she is a character who is only ever seen and explored through the eyes of others. This left Game of Thrones in a situation where they could essentially build her into whatever character they wanted to. And even despite her vague characterization in A Song of Ice and Fire, it's not hard to notice that the TV series took her in some interesting directions that might not be reflected in the future of the novels. The most striking difference between show Margaery and book Margaery is her age. While almost every character in A Song of Ice and Fire was aged up for Game of Thrones, Natalie Dormer was approximately twice the age of Margaery's written character when she started on the show. Given that the written Margaery is still in her mid-teens, it seems safe to assume that the Margaery we see on screen probably drastically differs from the character that she's actually meant to be. Natalie Dormer undoubtedly did a great job playing the character, and it's both common and understandable that productions cast older, more experienced actors in roles for younger characters, because finding a 16-year-old who could play someone who is cunning, devious, and a sincere rival for Cersei would be difficult. But from that point of view, one has to wonder if that was the actual intention behind Margaery's novel character in the first place. Because yes, the Margaery Tyrell of the books is undoubtedly a more politically savvy teenager than most of the other young characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. However, it seems pretty relevant to put that savviness in perspective, because she seems comparatively astute, but the other young characters who have starring roles in the story are actually woefully unprepared and uneducated regarding their potential futures. Ned Stark spent his entire life trying to shelter his children from the realities of the world, to the point that they were essentially hamstrung by the time reality slapped them in the face. Daenerys was a tween who was raised by another tween who didn't know anything about anything. And Cersei was an incredibly permissive parent who basically acted as if Joffrey could do no wrong. So not only are most of the kids in the story enormously, stupidly underprepared for what they're actually going to have to do, but their lack of political education is a driving force behind a lot of what happens in the plot. Margaery therefore contrasts sharply with most of the other characters in her age group, but that's not necessarily because she is a manipulative temptress or a political mastermind. Frankly, the more likely scenario seems to be that unlike all of the other major characters, she was actually prepared for the role that she was expecting to fulfill as an adult. Interestingly, the biggest insights that we get into Margaery Tyrell as a person are radically different, as the majority of her character development comes through the eyes of Sansa Stark and Cersei Lannister. She actually gets quite a bit of attention in Tyrion's chapters as well, but in terms of her actual personality exploration, the audience gets to know her mostly through her personal relationships with Sansa and Cersei. And unsurprisingly, their impression of the new queen seems to be diametrically opposed to one another, as Sansa seems to see Margaery as some sort of friend and at least thinks that she's kind, while Cersei thinks that Margaery is a devious schemer coming for her metaphorical and literal crown. Game of Thrones actually did a decent job of melding these two sides of her characterization together too, as she does seem to display genuine kindness towards Sansa, and is doing a ton of political maneuvering to usurp Cersei's position of power. However, the character that the TV series created relies on the notion that either of these points of views is reliable, which is a form of narrative trickery that George R.R. Martin likes to take a lot of advantage of. Even more interestingly, while Margaery clearly isn't portrayed as evil, Game of Thrones definitely leaned much harder into the Cersei version of Margaery than the Sansa version. Given the entire concept behind and title of the show, that shouldn't come as a huge surprise. But it is a bit strange considering the overall context of who Cersei Lannister is. Cersei is a narcissistic, misogynistic, paranoid, and gleefully cruel person who actually is as manipulative and cunning as she believes everyone else to be. However, all of these characteristics make her perspective on reality outrageously warped, and she is especially irrational and unhinged when it comes to young women who she believes could be her prophesied younger and more beautiful queen. The choice to see Margaery so distinctly through Sansa and Cersei's eyes is an interesting narrative choice as well, because in many senses, once Margaery is in a position where she's guaranteed to become queen, she is Cersei's new Sansa. And clearly, Cersei's perception of Sansa is also wildly off base. As we can see from Sansa's point of view, she's hardly a political mastermind, nor is she plotting against her captors in any kind of serious or advanced way. And yet, when Joffrey is killed at the Purple Wedding, surrounded by many people who undoubtedly hated him and wanted him dead, Cersei's instinct is that her tween-age hostage somehow managed to assassinate the king and disappear. In fairness, Sansa was intentionally framed for Joffrey's murder. But regardless of that frame job, it is inherently idiotic and implausible to think that Sansa, even with Tyrion's help, would be capable of pulling off such a massive conspiracy. So the fact that Cersei's immediate reaction is so ridiculous once again reiterates how unreasonable and unbelievable her point of view really is. Similarly, although the story never lets us see events through Margaery's eyes, essentially nothing that she actually does would irrefutably prove that she is the master manipulator that Cersei believes her to be. Undoubtedly, the Tyrells are good politicians, and Margaery wouldn't be nearly as ignorant of how things work as Sansa was. But it's possible, if not probable, that that's all she is. Because, despite the fact that every Lannister seemingly develops some kind of real or imagined rivalry with a teenager, in the real world, teenagers are ill-equipped to handle the level of political machinations that Cersei often attributes to people like Sansa or Margaery. If everyone involved in the Game of Thrones is a piece or a player, it actually seems more plausible that Margaery is still a piece who is being developed into a player. In fact, Margaery's lack of the kind of political acumen that the adults around her have seems to be proven by the fact that ultimately, Cersei did manage to outwit her. And while Cersei isn't as politically hapless as many seem to think she is, she's far from a mastermind either. Her paranoia about Margaery leads her to do something that is both foolish and insane. But Margaery does ultimately fall into her trap and is taken prisoner by the Faith. If she were the manipulative snake that Cersei believes her to be, then it's somewhat strange that she wasn't astute or clever enough to navigate her way out of Cersei's clutches. And again, I actually don't think Cersei typically gets the credit that she deserves when it comes to her political cunning, Her massive failings as a manipulator are almost immediately exposed when the Faith also takes Cersei under their control. Unfortunately, it's not the first or last time that Cersei underestimates someone that she believes to be her ally but is actually her opponent. But again, if Margaery were half the game player that Cersei believes her to be, then it's strange that she was so easily outgunned by someone who is immediately outgunned by someone else. It's interesting, because as a tactician and strategist, Cersei is better than many people seem to think. But arguably one of her biggest weaknesses is her ability to read people or understand people. Her personal point of view is so absurdly warped that she obsesses over the imagined threat that Margaery poses, despite the fact that she ultimately maneuvers Margaery into her trap quite easily. But she sees the Faith militant as a weapon that can be used against her enemies, and is completely caught off guard when they flip the script on her, despite the fact that this was a fairly predictable outcome. When she's looking for enemies, Cersei is often looking in the wrong places. And some of her biggest missteps are simply driven by the fact that she is abnormally focused on people who aren't really threats, while overlooking those who are working hard against her. Ergo, it's not that hard to believe that this is what could be happening with Margaery. Self-fulfilling prophecy is yet another huge theme within A Song of Ice and Fire, and Cersei has been on the lookout for the younger, more beautiful queen who would cast down all that she holds dear since she was a child. And as the old adage goes, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Sansa was the first nail that Cersei set her sights on, but Cersei's beliefs about her are almost entirely untrue. It stands to reason, then, that Margaery may be in very similar circumstances, and that she is truly nothing like the diabolical schemer that Cersei believes her to be. Yes, she may be slightly more politically educated than Sansa, but there is hardly any evidence that the manipulations Cersei sees are actually Margaery's intentions. However, while it is entirely possible that Game of Thrones essentially invented Margaery Tyrell based on Cersei's perception of her in the books, and that her characterization wasn't meant to be what she became in the TV adaptation at all, if this interpretation was wrong, George R.R. Martin didn't do anything to correct it. And strangely, that seems to be one of the more plausible justifications for the belief that Margaery actually is the person that Cersei believes her to be. Unfortunately, A Song of Ice and Fire isn't likely to let the readers have a peek into Margaery's point of view before Cersei offs her for good. But based on the consistent portrayal of teenagers in the story thus far, the notion that she is the master politician and sincere rival to Cersei that she was in Game of Thrones is extremely hard to believe. And clearly, there is some dramatic irony to the idea that Cersei was completely obsessed with the completely imagined threat that Margaery posed. But she will eventually make that threat become reality by turning House Tyrell, one of the few pseudo-allies the Lannisters have left at this point, against her. The Margaery Tyrell that appeared on screen was undoubtedly a compelling character and a fantastic political player who offered a lot to the development of the story at large. But it seems more likely than not that the original Margaery was little more than a teenage girl who knew how to play her role well, and who wound up in the sphere of an unhinged woman who fabricated a one-sided rivalry against her that will ultimately get her killed. Margaery Tyrell may be more politically educated and savvy than most of the young characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, but that's not saying much. And the fact that she was so easily outplayed by someone as tactically messy as Cersei can be seems to speak for itself and demonstrate that she's not the brilliant manipulator that Cersei believes her to be. Ironically, she's likely just a normal girl who was raised to fulfill her future role well, and who served as a key puzzle piece in her family's master plan. But sadly, the only way that she would probably have been able to survive Cersei is if she truly was the mastermind that Cersei was so afraid of in the first place. But what do you think? Is Margaery Tyrell a serious player in the Game of Thrones like Cersei thinks she is? Or is she just another piece who will fall victim to a game she wasn't prepared for? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.